All right, it's Wednesday, the 15th, which is
Eyes.
the Ides of March. Do we know what that means?
March.
Something with Caesar.
It was tax day, and when all of in ancient Greece and Rome, when all of the taxes were due and when all of so beware the Ides of March actually predated the
The use of
Caesar war.
Caesar.
Yeah,
That was impressive.
So what you're saying is that Shakespeare, of course, that Caesar had his face on the coins. It had a double meaning.
there
At
you go.
least a double meaning. If you were in the know, which I wasn't until.
Render to Caesar what is Caesar.
Not on my
That's
desk.
right. So we were gonna talk about the rental registry bill. And I just wanted to also review the rest of the day. We're gonna hear from witnesses for H332, which was an act related to a building energy code study committee. And then after the floor, we'll have a couple of bill introductions that are housing related. And they're the issues that, at least the eviction diversion program, will have some resonance to us in the second half of the year when we get, we'll be able to talk about more housing related issues when we get S100 from the Senate, which is their big housing bill. And then we'll be able to review a lot of these things that we weren't getting to as an individual bill, but be able to add them as amendments. But before that, just after we get off the floor, I'm hoping that, the conversation will be about, a few weeks ago, I mentioned that Representative Burrows, Representative Chestnut Tangerman, and Representative Lamont had met with representatives from Human Services to talk about the GA issue. And so I want to get a briefing on what happened there. But there's also some material that from that subgroup meeting with respect to a couple of reports that we're going to request. And it'll just be a question of, I'd like to get it done this week. They're the request for information in order to deal with the ending of the programs or the transition of the programs, the hotel programs. And so there's some language, there's two different reports of language that have been talked about between the subgroup and so we'll hear from them on that.
Can I make a suggestion? Is it possible to flip those two since the eviction diversion is part of the GA? It's its own thing and it's also,
Yeah, sure.
it doesn't have to be.
No, you're here, and as the sponsor, you're here, so it's not a big deal to switch it. But again, it's a concept that we're gonna look at the second half of the year.
Would it be appropriate for me to invite one of the two from the Human Services Committee to come?
Yes, it would be appropriate to do that, if they have the time. I know that I'm gonna try to meet with the speaker and with Representative Wood on the same issue, but that'll be just trying to strategize how we'll manage getting the language in to a document before a crossover or so that's today. And then tomorrow, based on the administration's testimony yesterday on the rental registry, The idea for me was to call in. Now I'm calling in, or I've invited in Sean Naylor, who is the head of the Agency of Digital Services. So perhaps there's a way to get, if not a back of the envelope or front of the envelope, then whatever, it's, to get a different, just to have testimony to find out how difficult it is to create a program as they were talking about. And again, this is from their perspective. We've also invited to have over the next, hopefully tomorrow, the Commissioner of Taxes talk about the landlord certification program. And I've also invited in Sarah Carpenter, who came in and testified at the beginning of this bill. She was from the Rental Housing Advisory Board. And I just wanted her to follow up her testimony and follow up the commissioner's testimony with some of the historical work that they did in terms of how they chose to budget the fee and what it was expected to pay for or what it could pay for if we pass this bill. So this morning I just wanted to kind of it's hard without half the committee here, or almost half the committee here. What I wanted to do was to review the bill, like I did with family leave, to go through line by line. And I'm kind of thinking in terms of just having David here to listen. David did hear all the testimony yesterday online, because that was Trina. Does that sound? I'm just torn because I don't know. I mean, I don't want you to be away from your meeting, but I also, if you go, then you don't. I don't know if six is not a quorum out of 12. I don't think.
There he is.
So do you still want me to start that process of going through? I mean, this is all recorded, so members who are missing can watch. So perhaps we could say that Representative Bartley was going to watch.
She said as she could, that she was in.
Okay. Okay.
Representative Elder, I think, will join after his medical.
Right. So bottom line is it's on YouTube and members can review it. But I think I'd like to just start reading through the bill. It's only 7 pages, with the understanding that it's just, I wanted to go back to the text of the bill to see where we are. I know that there's policy differences and policy conversations to have. But first time through, we'll flag them. We'll come back to them over the next day or so.
Do you need to come up or?
Yeah, please, I mean, David's here to answer specific questions, but I think if we go pull up the bill.
Do you want me to screen it or do one of you wanna?
What's that? Yes. Thank you, Dennis.
Do you have today's one?
Usually you always have it in the calendar invite, right?
I don't know that I.
Mr. Chair, do you want me to?
Yeah, if you want to
Up there,
scroll, yeah, if you could do that, that would be great.
I have it.
The bill's on the hot page. Oh, and while we're waiting, just as an FYI, I will not be here next
Tuesday to take a day trip to Boston. So, Representative Chestnut Tangerman, chair. And there will just be a bunch of bill introductions. Don't think that they're simple little bills and we should just pass 7 bills while I'm gone. I'd appreciate that. Unless, of course, you want to, I do believe that I asked Ron to schedule a sponsorship introduction on daylight savings time versus daylight standard time or standard Eastern Standard Time. So
Good luck with that.
exactly, but think of how many hours you can spend getting information on which one is better or which one is worse, or
Unless you get the other 5 New England states to go with you, I don't think that's going very far.
well, it's also saying to take a stand on one or the other.
Right.
And even in, I mean, the federal government, they made a lot of to-do last year about somebody introduced a bill, it was one thing, and then that got momentum for about 3 weeks, and then somebody said, no, it should be the other thing. And it's like, man, we had this conversation before. Until the
Right.
federal government decides to do it, then, but it certainly is
But
what
we are the strong little state.
We used to have a Great Lake too. So,
For 2 weeks.
yeah, so a lot greater about 10 million years ago.
Go.
Anyway,
Damn glacier.
so have you ever taken a tour of the CS?
Mm-hmm.
Just, the black tiles and have the trilobites in them or whatever. The only other place on Earth where this rock exists is like Namibia. Right, that's the only place, because of the way Pangea was apparently. And I heard one of the tour guides say to their group, and I imagine everybody does, but it's like even Vermont's not from Vermont. So, anyway, here we are with H276, and so David, if you can just I guess follow along with us, but I just want to, I'll just take people through the bill, and then like I said, anything that gets, we can have as much discussion as we need to on each particular item, but for more policy oriented stuff, we can say that till tomorrow. We'll just flag it and come back to it. It would just be nice to get through the 7 pages. And we'll do this a couple of times more before Friday, just to make sure we know what we're voting on. That's the most important piece to me, that we didn't forget that there was a nuance here or there. So starting on line 8, so it's section 2678. So except as otherwise provided in subsection B, so that's those that can be the exemptions, annually or on before March 1st, the owner of each rental housing that in the previous year was leased or offered for lease shall pay to the Department of Housing and Community Development an annual registration fee of $35 per unit and provide the following information. So that goes to what David had mentioned earlier, which is it's a look back. The registration is based on a look back to what you did the year before. So if you had a house that you rented on a short-term basis or on a long-term basis, had a unit in your house or used your house for those things, that you would still file. But the registration fee is just per unit, not per registration. We'd be asking for the name and address of the owner, landlord, and property manager of the unit as applicable, which speaks a little bit to what we heard of yesterday from the ski association, where they do have property managers. I mean, there's obviously a lot of places that have property managers, but I think it fits into her conversation where if the unit was publicly available and it didn't fall under the registered lodging, that they'd have to register it. The phone number and electronic email address of the owner, landlord, or property manager of the unit as available, where it is located, the year it was built, the type of rental unit, so short or long term, the number of units in the building, the school property account number, and the accessibility of the unit and any other information the department deems appropriate. On line 4, the exceptions are a unit registered with another program. So this does not, the registration requirement does not apply to a unit that's currently registered with a municipal district or other local government rental housing and health and safety program that requires the owner to register the unit and provide the data required in subsection A. So this is just saying if it's already registered locally, it doesn't need to be registered in this program because that information will end up being ported over. And the fee requirement imposed in subsection A does not apply to a unit that's registered with a municipal district or other local government rental housing safety, health and safety program. This is ideally this is saying that the fee is not, there's no duplicative fees. Joe?
This is something I didn't even really think too much about until yesterday, realizing that we don't have any money in this thing for any, I mean, we have to charge, I guess, but like the startup of running a system to actually do this. And it didn't, I think part of the reason is that, you know, it's not in here that we're setting aside money to set up something. So yesterday, when Commissioner Hanford was talking about this, it just seems odd that we're gonna operate the state system on funds only from people, the rental units that aren't currently in. So your Burlington, St. Johnsbury, other cities. And it seems odd that they would get away with not having to pitch in to pay for this whole system when there's gonna be a part of it in a way. So that one's kind of troubling. Doesn't seem, I guess fair would be the word, that this program we're gonna set up to have all the information at hand is gonna be paid for by only some of the people. And we're not asking these other municipal run programs to pitch in to that system. I'm saying you just give us your information and that's it. We'll put it in the program and we're gonna run that program on the backs of everybody else.
All right, well, let's pin that and have
Yeah.
that as a conversation. It's a fair conversation to have. Yeah.
Just to, piggyback on what Representative Parson said about, the startup costs. We heard there was gonna be like, $1 million. Is that gonna be enough, even just with the fees alone? Is it gonna be enough to generate? Without adding, like if you will, for lack of a better word, a subsidy to get it going?
I think again, we'll hear more. I don't know if we'll get a finer detail, but we're going to hear from ADS tomorrow, and the tax department tomorrow. So we can find out what it's going to cost or the estimate. The thing about the fees, so what the commissioner was saying about the enforcement program that's underway at the Department of Fire Safety is, this program was, yes, it was originally tied to the enforcement program because the enforcement was about health and safety. It was adding health and safety, habitability to what the Department of Fire Safety is already allowed to do if they get called in to an apartment on a complaint, and this is still complaint driven. The fees raised, so there's 80,000, right? We heard the number of 80,000 some odd units statewide. And I have some numbers that I'm gonna have Sarah Carpenter testify on about the number, the eligible units. Her estimate, the Rental Housing Advisory Board's estimate was that 55,000 units would be eligible to register. And then she has a breakdown of what 40%, 50%, 60% participation of the people who are not. Well, the people who have already paid. This is the 55,000 is statewide less the Burlingtons and the Barrys and St. Johnsbury's or the system. So we can put into the bill an appropriation request. The fees would generate, I mean, the math I did on if 40,000 units paid $35 a day, that's $1.4 million. I'm assuming that the cost for 2 people in DHCD to run this has 1.5 people in it. But it doesn't take into account the software development fees. So we can add that. But I think, we've made the request for $200,000 for that position, for those 2 positions. And that would be required to pass we can add that and pass this along to the money committees and they can say yes or no on the money. But the idea that there would be 1 point something million or at some number of the fees would ostensibly cover the costs of maintenance of the program. And it was originally supposed to go to paying for the enforcers, for the inspectors of DFS, which it can still do. DFS has traditionally functioned quite a bit on fees, what they charge for safety fees and permits. Because we haven't raised fees for a long time, we're using general fund dollars to fill in the gaps. But at any rate, that's what's, I think, I'm not sure, did I answer?
Yeah, you did.
Okay.
Thank
So
you.
we would add the number to this, our best estimate, and JFO would do a fiscal note on this after we pass the bill. They won't do a fiscal note before we vote on the bill. They need to know that it's the final ingredients before they move forward. But again, we'll hear from Sarah Carpenter hopefully tomorrow to talk about why the fee structure was such as it was. That was the commissioner questioned that, and it's worth getting updated information on it. Yes.
IT, have they had an opportunity to see what the needs of this bill are, information transfer wise? We've asked the commissioner of ADS to come in. So I would expect that he would have that answer. That's why we'll call it for cost, but also, what do you mean transferring Well, the Burlingtons that have been registered, the Brattleboro's that have been registered municipally.
Yeah.
We want to suck in all that information and then add to it a line item or 2 that theirs may not be asking for information.
Right.
To put that into it. From my previous employment, we had a software package called Cloverleaf that from every portion of the hospital, everything flowed into Cloverleaf. And that was the repository. And anybody who wanted information out of that could just put in what they wanted. And it would extract it and pull it out. I don't even know if Cloverleaf exists now because that was 8 or 10 years ago.
Right.
But I'm sure it's been replaced by something perhaps faster and more modern. But if not, then the writing of the code could run you a lot more than 1.4.
Or there might be a way for the state to, if all these municipalities already have these databases, there might be a way for the state to just capture their existing coding.
Right, and that's what the development is
Right.
Yeah.
is about. And the other we'll have these questions about The other, and this is adjunct to your, I think, in terms of the commissioner testified about, well, the data's available in a bunch of different places. And I know the conversation over time has been, we've had this conversation over time, but we're gonna ask him like, well, really, what is it that you can pull from the land? I mean, can you even pull tax documents from and use I mean, because my memory is that the tax system is really pretty privacy oriented because, for obvious reasons. There's some information that was publicly available, but there's been a reluctance to share that information or to break into, to be allowed to harvest that information. But we'll hear more. These are specific questions for Sarah and for the tax.
Yeah, well, the other consideration that I was thinking about was, since those municipalities that are already a pre-registration process, there's no skin in the game for them. So why would they allow our enforcement people to go in and look at their rental?
I think the idea has been that their programs would run, like the state inspectors, unless called in, wouldn't necessarily go to Burlington because they already have a fairly robust enforcement program. But yeah, let's just keep concentrating.
I just be careful again not to conflate the registry and the scope of authority and jurisdiction of fire safety, regardless of whether a municipality has its own program. Fire safety and the Department of Health continue to have jurisdiction over the units in those municipalities. So, like you said, there's not sufficient capacity at health or fire safety to do sort of a rolling kind of inspection. That's never the plan, or
It never made sense without a enforcement division of 100 people.
right. So that's unlikely to happen, but they have the legal ability and authority to be able to go into any unit at this point. So if
Right, and David, would it be fair to draw the what we ended up passing last year in order to do the enforcement was fire safety is allowed to make inspections, some safety inspections related to obviously electrical in any commercial property, which is what an apartment would be. But there was a dichotomy between what they were quote unquote allowed to observe and ticket as opposed to what the Department of Health used to have the responsibilities for. And we took that Department of Health language, those responsibilities, and added them to the Department of Fire Safety with a transition period. Is that accurate that if the department prior to the enforcement, right, again, I'm minding that this is not about enforcement, 276 is not enforcement, just to clarify that more responsibility was given to DFS to do health and safety enforcement?
So I think what's important to keep in perspective is that there's a disconnect between the words on the page and the reality of its implementation. So historically, the Department of Health always had the ability, and in fact was the entity with the health and safety rules that nominally had statewide authority to do health and safety inspections and enforcement. Health just never had the capacity to do that. That's why the system devolved primarily to the municipalities and the local health authorities, which was determined ultimately to be insufficient. The intention of the migration of the nominal primary state authority from health to fire safety and the addition of the 5 inspectors was to give a clear, basically, statement of authority to DFS and then some more personnel to be able to actually implement the health and safety rule and to, effectuate inspections, enforcement when necessary. But health still has its authority over public health hazards, public health emergencies, it's just DFS and local, not only local municipalities who have their own programs, but also municipalities across the state still have local health officials, still have local authority over rental health and safety. It's more like a tripartite system now with DFS nominally at the top, with some more capacity, with some more money, with a clear mandate. DOH more limited to the public health hazard or emergency side, and municipalities at the local level still in charge, but able to call on state assistance or even to ask the state to, we don't have a local health officer, nobody will take the job, we're gonna need you to be more involved here.
Right, and so originally, the only connection between that section and this section was how to pay for the increased enforcement. That's why the fee would stay here, was to make sure, because otherwise, if it was in general fund, it leaves it up to the legislature to fund that every single year. It's not an ongoing thing, whereas the fees would be an ongoing revenue source in order to keep enforcement going, and takes it out of the budgeting realm the way they might have to experience it every year in order to increase the numbers we gave. We also gave them authority to have up to 5 enforcers, inspectors statewide. So now, let's just leave enforcement behind or just keep going with, we were on line 17, mobile homes. So the registration requirement imposed does not apply to a mobile home lot within a mobile home park if the owner has registered the lot with the Department of Housing and Community Development. We heard that yesterday. So that's just the lot. The owner does not own a mobile home on the lot. So a mobile home park owner at base owns the land, the acreage and the pads, and that's what they rent out, the space for each home surrounding that pad. Unless they have, of their own accord, a mobile home that they rent out. That would have to be registered. B is like an owner of a mobile home park within a mobile home, a mobile home lot within a mobile home park, who's registered the lot with the department and who owns a mobile home on the lot, shall register that property with the department pursuant to subsection A and pay the fee, because that's a separate unit. And as is the case in many of the mobile home parks, if there's an owner of a mobile home who rents it, whether or not it's located in the mobile home park, shall register pursuant to the section. So if I lived in a house and still owned a mobile home in some park, and I was renting it, I'd have to register that as if it were an apartment or a house. Yeah, Representative Parsons.
Thanks. I just wonder, could you clarify for me section A there? Registration requirement was applied to a mobile home lot with a mobile home park so if that whole mobile home park and all the lots are registered already through the program that they already have for mobile home parks, then they don't have to join this one.
Right.
But then, and the owner doesn't, so if I own a mobile home park and I live in it, now I can't be exempted? Is that how that reads?
No, it's each individual. If the owner lives in a mobile home
In the park?
in the park, does that owner, he or she or they have already registered the park and the number of pads, the number of lots that are in the park.
Yeah, I'm just saying the way number 2 there reads, to me, maybe you can clear this up. It sounds like you have to not own a lot in that mobile home park in order for you to.
So owner refers back to the lot itself. And it could be that an individual owns a whole park and then therefore they own a whole bunch of lots. but the requirements are pegged to each individual lot. So if it's just a lot that you are renting, and it's in a mobile home park, there's already a registration program for that, for the parks, and within that park registration, each lot, and the DHCD already gets all the information about the lot. So we don't need that twice, is what this is saying. So if you are just renting the lot and the lot is already in the system, then you don't have to separately register that lot here. It's already registered there. The distinction is in two, is a separate question of whether or not there's actually a mobile home that is being rented. So if you're renting a mobile home, that home has to be registered as a rental unit on this, because it's not part of the park registration. It's not part of the lot profile. It's a separate rental of its own.
But I think with Representative Parsons' comment, the way that can be read is that the question I think you're asking is that if they own a mobile home for their personal use on the lot, as opposed to a mobile home that's used for rental purposes. Is that
Yeah, exactly.
the assumption that, or the nuance?
So your unit would already be in that, everything that's sent to DHCD.
So if you live in a mobile home on a lot, you're not required to register anyway, because you're not renting it. So you don't need an exemption because there's no requirement. Does that make sense? Am I missing something?
Yeah. True. No, I just wasn't thinking that.
This mobile home part has always been the most confusing part of the whole thing. Because there's already a registry and it's in the same place. So it's like, God, we're like twisting ourselves in pretzels just to make sure these people don't have to register twice.
What if you're one of those people that creates a company that owns the mobile home park?
Right.
You rent to yourself.
Then I guess you have to register. I don't know.
You have to register the unit. I mean, that's.
The company would have to be registered, but not the individual.
I'm just trying to think the way I was right.
I think you got it right there.
There you go.
All right, so
My copy.
exemptions and explanations to go to, again, the complicated nature of mobile homes anyway. Of, someone can own the park and rent out the pad, someone can own the park and a place to rent out, and they could own, but more often than not, perhaps the owner of the mobile or the manufactured home owns the home but not the lot, et cetera, et cetera. It's just there's always going to be some pretzel logic to any kind of mobile home text. The line 10 is unit not offered to general public. So this section, the requirement is the registration does not apply to a unit that an owner provides to another person, whether or not for consideration, if and only to the extent that the owner does not otherwise make the unit available for lease to the general public. And includes housing, and again, includes, also meaning includes, but is not limited to. Actually, before we get into A, B, and C of the matter, any questions on lines 10 through 14? This is just saying if I never advertise my, a bedroom or a unit that's in my house for rent, then I'm not gonna need to register. But if I do put it on Front Porch Forum, if I do put it on Craigslist, then it becomes available to the general public. And then the other things that were on line 12, never mind. We were thinking about home shares, we were thinking about situations or family, and then in A, B, and C, we get a little bit more specific. Representative Parsons?
Thank you. Would this allow somebody who has long-time tenants who have every plan to just keep staying there to not have to join this because they're not making it available to the public, they're not advertising it, they're not doing anything, the person lives there and they're staying?
I would think that if that's the case, that when they lose their tenant or the tenant moves out or the
Then they
changes, that if they advertise it, but if they're in a position where they traditionally don't advertise it because they've had longtime tenants, they could, I would imagine that they could say that they qualify to not for this exemption. So A, housing provided to a member of the owner's family, personal acquaintances. B, housing provided to a person who's not related to a member of the owner's household and who occupies the housing as part of a nonprofit home sharing program. C, so that would include some, we've heard about disabilities council and home sharing with folks with disabilities, but there's also some programs spread out throughout the state that set up home sharing. That's not generally open in the same way that other rentals are. C, housing provided to a person who provides personal care to the owner or a member of the owner's household. Number 4, top of page 4, licensed lodging establishment, which is what Molly Mahar from the Ski Association was talking about. The registration fee imposed in this section does not apply to a lodging establishment as defined that's required to be licensed by the Department of Health. And so she was asking it to specify somehow, if necessary, that units in what she was calling their rental pool does it apply to them? And I think this definition is broad enough to say that it's covered because they're already licensed by the Department of Health. David, any thoughts on that? I think, when we chatted earlier, it was pretty ambiguous, I think, that they're.
I think it's important to remember the scope of licensed lodging establishment. It's quite broad. And, again, in the same vein of the mobile home lot registry, we're trying to avoid double dipping here or double imposition of administrative burden and cost. And so you're supposed to be licensed if you are a lodging establishment. So a lodging establishment, you'll see here, it's in Title 18, means a place where overnight accommodations are regularly provided to the transient, traveling, or vacationing public, including hotels, motels, inns, and bed and breakfasts. Now, it does not include short-term rentals. So I would say to you, STR, short-term rentals, sort of got a carve out from what would otherwise be a requirement to be licensed. And by factoring them out of this definition and setting up a different standard for short-term rentals, which you'll see here, it's a furnished house, condominium, or other dwelling room, or self-contained dwelling unit rented to the transient, traveling, or vacationing public for a period of fewer than 30 consecutive days or more than 14 days per calendar year. So really an STR is just a kind of E&B, right? That gets a carve out because it's probably something somebody does on the side rather than being engaged in the business of operating a hotel or an inn or a bed and breakfast. You are exempting licensed lodging establishments here, again, because they are licensed. They're ostensibly engaged in the business of running a hotel, running an inn, running a B&B. They're not doing this on the side, part-time, blah, blah, blah. The other underlying theory is that a short-term rental, at least the popular thinking goes right now, is that they are displacing what would otherwise be available housing stock, which is probably not the case for a bed and breakfast or a motel or a hotel or an inn. So that's really sort of the dividing line here. And it's going to come down to the individual unit. Like I listened to the ski area's testimony. Let's say they've got up at a ski area, they've got a hotel, that's a licensed lodging establishment. Even if they rent some of their rooms out as STRs occasionally, it's still a licensed hotel. So it's still in with the Department of Health, still subject to inspection, health regulation, et cetera. If it's an individual condo unit at a ski area, it's going to depend on how that individual condo unit is used. If it's offered, as a short-term rental, and that means it meets the definition of STR, then technically it's not a licensed lodging establishment, and it would be required to register. If it's a condo that is just all they do with it is rent it like a hotel room, it needs to be licensed with DOH, whether it is or not.
So in that case, it could be saying you could have a single room with a king bed, or you can have a suite with a king bed, or you can have a condo with it would be in that kind of, that's the way they might advertise it, is just as another definition, a 2-bedroom unit or a 3-bedroom unit, whatever.
Yeah. I haven't looked at it in a few years, so just for the record, I'm sure there's people listening that will be able to help me or correct me, or I can come back. But I think in the rules, there is an exemption from licensure if you own fewer than X number of units, and it's a small number. I think if you operate 3 or 4 or fewer, then you don't have to be licensed. But
From the Department of Health.
yes, from the DOH rules, but I'd have to look that up.
Okay.
So really small scale, you might not have to be licensed anyway. But in that case, you would have to be on the registry.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm kind of swimming on this one at the moment of how, there's a lot of moving parts to this that don't really fit. I understand, I guess I'd be curious to see what that Department of Health license looks like.
Yeah.
To see the language in it, to understand, does that license allow them to become stewards of somebody else's property? And now their license covers them to be stewards of that property? It's not theirs. It's the third party in it.
I'm confused. Do you mean like a condo that's
Yeah.
part of a?
Yeah, like our example of a ski resort with condos.
Right. Well, so so you have to think about the ownership structure is what it should come down to. If the ski resort owns the condos, it's the owner, and then the use of that unit should be what triggers whatever licensing requirements do or don't apply. So I guess somebody from health or otherwise could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it should come down to the ownership structure of the particular unit. So you have a hotel that's, one thing, a condo, even though it's part of a common building and enterprise, is marked by individual ownership of that unit, right? So these risk pool or rental pools, I believe everybody still owns their individual units. They just work together to decide like how we're gonna.
The ski area becomes your
Right. It could. So that depend. So again, that'll depend on how they're using the particular units. Are they individually licensed? Do they have? It's a good question you have. Do they have a single license that might cover multiple properties that they own? I don't know, but
What they said yesterday was, if the resort ends up being the property management system, right, in this rental pool, they sign there's a contract between them and the owner to manage that property, and then if it's rented out, again, the clarification is that short-term rental is definitely, we talked a little bit yesterday about what if they have a 3-month contract and a 3-month lease, whatever, that makes it a long-term rental period. But the idea here was that there would be a contract between property management and the owner of the condo unit.
I'm just not sure that that impacts this because this is geared toward how is that property used? And again, remember the duty to register applies on a per unit basis based on the use of that unit
Previous year.
in the previous year. And again, there could be multiple uses during the year, but if any, I would say that if one of your uses triggers those, then you're required to register. So it's just like the unit that's offered to the general public. Maybe 9 months of the year, your son lived there for free, but if you rented it the other 3 months of the year, you're in.
Oh, I was just gonna say, and I was listening yesterday. One of my friends owns, 2 units in Stowe, and I stayed there. And I checked in, and again, I don't even know if this pertains to this, but I was just explaining that I've been through it. So I went, I check in, I signed something. The hotel's responsible for the cleaning, everything that's inside. But she, as an owner, can stay there as much as she wants. She just blacks out the dates that she wants. And then when others can come and go, they do. But everything, you still have to pay the hotel for all the maintenance and the fees.
Right, so that management side contract shouldn't affect this
Right.
in any way. Like who,
Yeah, it sounds like it could be, the only reason property management might be on there is if it's part of the registration.
if there's some other basis for you having to register, in which case that property manager, the name and address would need to come along as part of the information for that unit. But their involvement doesn't affect her duty to register, which will depend on how she uses the unit in the 12-month period.
Right.
And what was the cutoff if she stayed there X amount of months on her own?
She's not renting to herself, so that
Right.
also doesn't.
Okay.
It depends on what she makes available to the public for terms of rent. I mean, some years she could rent it for 6 months to somebody from Florida, in which case it's a rental. And it's actually subject to 9 VSA chapter 137, and you're definitely required to register that.
Got it.
Yeah.
So the way I'm reading this right now is that it's this condo unit we're speaking of doesn't qualify for this exemption in 4 because we have a carve out for short-term rentals.
There's no carve out for short-term rentals. They're required to register.
I'm talking about under the 18. This gives them, says that they don't have to join this pool if they're a hotel or a B&B.
If they're licensed,
Right.
then they do not have to register.
I'm saying these, as I'm reading this right now, those units, condo units, do have to register with this.
They would, unless they are separately licensed lodging establishments.
And
Or as you said, they are somehow under a broader license. For instance, like Killington Resort owns a hotel and 50 condos and the license covers
Yeah.
all of
Properties
those.
they own.
Then those are exempt because they're covered by a license. That's because they're already registered with the Department of Health as a lodging establishment, and that's part of their lodging establishment that's licensed. But if they're not under a license, then they would have a separate duty to register here.
yeah, it's still flaking my mind, which is both a hotel and a
Right.
series of condominiums.
That's what I was thinking.
Okay, line 5, section 5, non-winterized seasonal units, the registration fee and fee requirements does not apply to a seasonal unit that's unheated and unavailable for rent during the winter months. That's camp definition.
So when we previously talked about this one, I had raised, and I think you guys were gonna consider whether it should be pegged to a particular season, whether heat is really the deciding determinative factor, or whether it's more like it doesn't have whatever facilities, heat, electricity, sanitation, potable water, some other indicium of not really being capable of utilized as a full-time residence. And I didn't know if that were a direction you still wanted to go, or if this is sufficient. It doesn't matter to me either way. I just, again, the tension is, if we need an exemption for places that you can't actually live in, is this too narrow? Or is it too broad in that we actually want to know what all of those units are, because at any given time, they could be utilized as a residence.
So it's basically folks that are not, or structures that do not meet health department codes, certain health department habitability codes. But again, the original intent was to say camps.
Yep.
The question of enlarging it is, what about that beat up old house in the back 40 of this property that doesn't have running water, doesn't have a bathroom, doesn't have electricity.
But it might have a wood stove.
Right.
So it's not technically unheated.
So can you wordsmith something that just addresses what do we consider housing? I mean, it's not, we can't just say camp, but if we can say something that is legalese, uninhabitable, otherwise uninhabitable or uninhabitable by these means, by the definition, which if it doesn't have, I guess I'm making an assumption that if it doesn't have running water or plumbing or a bathroom or heat, that it doesn't qualify for certain standard of living, right?
I would say it doesn't have sufficient facilities to serve as a permanent
Permanent primary residence.
primary residence.
Yeah, that's good.
So many syllables.
So I just want to make sure I understand where this fits in. So if you have a place that you rent out 6 months of the year and then shut down in the winter,
I that would count in my book.
you would need to register that. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, ready for 6?
And that makes that clear. It would still,
Not right now. I think we'll
We'll look at the next slide.
okay, got it.
All right, number 6, the housing provided as a benefit of farm employment. The registration fees does not apply to a unit of housing that is provided as a benefit of farm employment as defined. So this is, I think we had again, familiarity with the language says, this can be considered fine, but I don't know if it is. So, a benefit, there is a, David, in farm employment, housing is treated different when it's a benefit than conventional rental housing.
Broadly, yes, that's true. There's, nuance. It is not, so this housing is not subject to all of the provisions of the landlord-tenant chapter. There are important differences, particularly in the removal of the tenant, in the ejectment, because it is part of your compensation, part of your employment contract that you get this housing and the housing needs to move with the position. So that's really the difference. You'll see, so termination of occupancy of farm employee housing. So housing provided as a benefit of farm employment is housing owned or controlled by the farm employer, whether located on or off the farm premises, and provided for the occupancy of the farm employee and the farm employee's family or household members for no payment other than the farm employee's labor. Payment of utility and fuel charges paid by the farm employee does not affect the designation of housing provided as a benefit of farm employment. So this is not housing that you also rent from your farm employer. This is housing that they provide to you as part of your employment for no rent. It's part of your compensation, and that's the dividing line. So again, this is not housing that when used in this capacity is not housing that's available for rent. It's only available to an employee. And again, if that construct changed such that during the course of the year, the farmer rented the housing to somebody else, then that's gonna trigger the requirement that they register it as a rental unit. You'll see here at the end, sections 44, 55, 61, and 67 don't apply to this type of housing. So 55, 61, and 67. That's the payment of rent, security deposit, and the termination of the tenancy. Those things don't apply because there is no rent, there's no security deposit, and the ejectment process is different.
And can you touch on 45, I'm sorry, go to 4558 there, which is the habitability part as
Those
well?
do apply. So habitability, landlord and tenant duties are relating to the occupancy of the unit do apply. So on the landlord side, right to quiet enjoyment, habitability, fitness for habitation, etc. On the tenant side, right of quiet and enjoyment, don't trash the place. If you break things, you're owned for it. Don't disturb other tenants, etc.
And while focusing on this for the purpose of this bill, I also want to just point out, we may have a conversation about farm housing during this biennium, so just know that there's this whole section. Someday you will get lost in some August afternoon, sitting out on the back deck and going, hey, I want to read Title IX. You can just see it now, can't you?
August reading.
It is interesting to me.
Anyway, all right, so that's what this section is doing, and then we also have, later on, we have, we sunset this,
That's true.
and the question is, based on that, hearing that definition again, where housing is provided in lieu of rent, do we need to sunset it? Or, we have to mention it or else it's included, right? If we don't exclude it, it's included because, the question is, do we have?
Actually, I think it could already fit under the exemption of not available to the general public. I think you called it out as an exclusion separately because you intended to sunset it. And you intended to sunset it because you had not had a robust discussion or understanding yet of what you wanted to do with it.
And I think we also, at one point, I think this is back when it was S79, to connect it to enforcement was that there's also kind of an understanding that farm housing, and we had taken testimony from migrant workers about how uncomfortable some of the housing can be. And not up to code or not up to, I think we wanted to make sure that the community had an opportunity to bring their stuff up to code using the VHIP money as well, and it was something to think about over the next few hours, 48, 72 hours about whether we need to exempt them at all, if it fits, because it's very specific to Right now, it's very specific that to a benefit of farm employment, as we just saw defined, if rent is not being taken in.
Right.
So you could,
You could put it under this section, right?
right, you could make it a D here, and call it out as one of the things you consider to be within this exemption, if you wanted to do it that way.
Yeah, let's do that.
I like that.
Or, yeah, let's see that, and, cause I don't think it needs to be repealed.
Another thing I was considering, after Representative Parsons' good questions about the licensed lodging establishment is, you could put that one under one as well as being a unit that is registered with another program. There may be benefits to keep it separate, but so if you think about B1, 2, and 4, those really are, there's basically 3 categories here. There's units that might be registered but are already registered somewhere else. There's units that don't need to be registered because they're not actually available to the public for rent. And then there's units that aren't registered because they're not actually rental units. Right? So the camps, the short terms, the buses back in the woods. So that's just another way to think about the groupings. And if you wanted to have one category, things that are already registered somewhere else, then mobile homes and hotels would go in that category too. You don't have to reorganize this in that way. You can leave it how it is. I'm just suggesting that may be another way to think about it altogether.
No, it's a good way to think about it. I don't know about reestablishing that, but I think for explanation, because a lot of this came out of the what ifs, the what if questions, or what about this questions, and we do a lot, and that's why we came up with this particular list, and that's why I like the A, B, and C as not as specific things like number 5 is, but that they're suggestions, they're kind of the what ifs, and it would be up to the department to interpret far more questions. But these were the examples that we gave.
I think inevitably thinking about it categorically will be important because the department will be faced with questions of, oh, how about this unit that I rent to my aunt for, but blah, 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 it doesn't have a stove. I mean, it's gonna happen.
Yeah.
And they're gonna have to make a judgment call on whether or not
But would you like to be able to like noodle on it for till tomorrow? And
No, I'm just offering the option if you guys want me to regroup the exemptions.
if you can show us a draft, that would be.
Okay.
Let's stop there, and we will pick up on the next time we deal with this. So it's halfway through. It's line 13 of page 4. So we got halfway through, and we'll pick this up tomorrow. And we'll. No, good questions, folks. And let's take. We have 3:32 coming in at quarter of. Are they coming in or are they?
Yeah, I was
We'll
wondering.
get about